Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Renee, and I'm a Senior Services Coordinator at Schaumburg Township District Library. And I'm here with my colleague, Matt, and we're both from the Schaumburg Library Programs and Outreach Department. And our very special guest today is Elizabeth Letts. She's the best-selling and very versatile author. Among her books, Finding Dorothy, The Perfect Horse, The $80 Champion, and more. And I hope we'll be finding out more about her newest book and so forth. We'll also be taking your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So, Finding Dorothy, your book, was so enjoyed by our book club members, and it weaves together the lives of Maud Gage, who married L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, and the lives of Maud's suffragist mother, Matilda Gage, and it recounts when Maud also meets Judy Garland on the set of The Wizard of Oz. So at the end of the book, you talk about what interested you in Frank and Maud's story. So we'd love to have you reflect a little bit on that.
Well, sure. I think, it's really interesting. One of the questions that I'm asked a lot as an author is, where do you get your ideas? And, you wish that you had some systematic kind of answer that made a whole lot of sense. I seem to always become interested in stories by accident. And this story kind of found me when I was reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book, aloud to my youngest son as a bedtime story. And as I was reading it, I thought to myself, who is this person who wrote this book? It had this layer, to the story that I had never recognized. Now, I did read the entire series as a child, but for some reason as a child, the series didn't stick with me or something. But when I read it as an adult, there was something in the perspective, particularly the attitude toward women, that made me wonder about the author. And that was when I realized I didn't know anything about the author, L. Frank Baum, The Wizard of Oz being one of our most famous American stories. And I thought, well, why don't know anything about him? So, I did what serious researchers do when they're curious about something. I quickly Wikipedia'd him. And when I read L. Frank Baum's Wikipedia page, that is when I discovered his wife, Maud, and his mother-in-law, Matilda. And I thought, okay, this is a man who married a woman who was one of the first women to attend an Ivy League college, and who was the son-in-law of one of the most forward-thinking and really, truly radical feminists of the 19th century. And I thought, okay, well, that answers that. Now I know why I felt that there was something going on in The Wizard of Oz, and I forgot about it. I wasn't thinking to write a book about it or, anything like that. But the story kind of stuck in the back of my mind. And then one day, by accident, I came across a picture, and it was a picture of Maud Baum, and she was sitting at the MGM studios with Judy Garland. And it was when I saw that picture, and this is really what it is to be a writer, it's when you want to know something, but you can't find the answer, So I go back to Wikipedia and I'm like, what happened when Maud Gage Baum met Judy Garland? Well, I didn't find anything. And that's when my little spidey sense started working. And I started saying, I think there might be a story here. And so that was my inspiration. So it was the photo, really, but it was kind of all of everything that went before it.
I did want to ask a question from one of our book club members who was so excited and thrilled that we were going to be interviewing you. She also wanted to know about the angle that had you start researching the story, but mainly, was it Frank, the suffrage story, or the classic movie? And she says, and I love her quote, "It all goes together so well," wondering how long did the project take from start to finish?
Well, I really love that question. And I feel like if I were being honest, the answer of how long did it take me to write Finding Dorothy would be since 1966. which is the first time I saw the Wizard of Oz movie. It, you know, I love that. And in the mind of a writer, there is a process that takes place where you have these building blocks, at least for me, and I don't know whether everybody is the same, but you have these building blocks that start over time, and you build and you build, and you become more and more interested in certain things. And so your book club member, very perceptive, so perceptive, because honestly, I would have to say that it was all of those pieces that resonated with me somehow. So let's start with the movie. The movie, I'm typical girl of the 60s. I watched it every year, you know, and I loved it. And I had an imaginary friend named Dorothy, and I played Dorothy in the 5th grade play. I love The Wizard of Oz, and I love the movie, and I've seen it so many times, and I quote it all the time, and it has this very special meaning in my heart, which I never really realized until I wrote this book how universal that is, how many people feel that way. So I had that, but I never thought of writing a book about the Wizard of Oz. Now you go to the women's suffrage movement. I have had a lifelong fascination with the progressive movement and the women who were involved in abolition and the movement for suffrage in the late 19th century. I majored in history in college, and that was the time period that I focused on. I focused on a topic related to women at that time. Again, I didn't think, you know, when I was a little 21-year-old studying history in college that I would someday write a book about that. But then L. Frank Baum, here's the extra piece, right? Because I didn't know I was interested in L. Frank Baum because I didn't know anything about him. And I do know a lot about a lot of writers, especially I have a real passion for children's literature, to the point that sometimes it surprises me that I didn't choose to write it. And I don't think that's my gift, but I have a very great love for children's books, for children's authors. So it was natural for me to take an interest in him. But would I have taken an interest in Frank if he wasn't Matilda's son-in-law and Maud's husband? Probably not. So now give a little more direct answer though, how long did it take me to write the book from inspiration to completion? About 3 years. And when authors are writing books, at least for me, I'm usually working on more than one thing at once because there's a really prolonged editorial period from the time you finish a book to when it actually comes out in libraries and stores. It's usually about 18 months. And during that time, a lot of the work is being done by my editor and proofreaders and art director designing the cover. And so I'm still involved in that project, but I've usually started my next one. So I was working on Finding Dorothy while I was also working on The Perfect Horse, and I would set it aside for a while and then I would come back to it. So the only book I really wrote straight through start to finish was my very first book.
So I was just struck by the research that you did and all the list at the end of The Perfect Horse. So both in Finding Dorothy and in The Perfect Horse. Did all this research take you to interesting places?
Well, I have to say, so I'm a road trip junkie. I'm an American road trip junkie. I love nothing more than getting in my car and driving across the country. I've done it more times than I don't know how many times I've done it. And so I do. I love road trips. And so Finding Dorothy was really great for me because I did go to the locales that are described in the book for the most part. Interestingly, I never got a chance to go to Fayetteville, New York, which is Maud's hometown. And I very much wanted to, but I spent quite a lot of time in South Dakota. And I really love South Dakota. I think it's a very beautiful state. I think it's a very interesting state. Any excuse I get to go there. But I went to the town Aberdeen where Frank and Maud lived. And so this is a library story because I really love librarians more than anything and libraries more than anything. But there's a library in Aberdeen that actually has a very, very, very extensive collection that was donated to the library by one of Maud's nieces, who actually doesn't figure in my book at all. But she had a niece whose name was Matilda Jewel Gage, and she lived to be almost, I think, almost 100 years old. And she donated her personal papers to this library in Aberdeen. And I went and I said, well, can I see the collection? And the lovely librarian says to me, oh, sure. And just sets me up kind of in one of the back rooms, where you're behind the scenes rooms where the sausage is made kind of, and brought up these carts full of boxes. And when I opened them, it was like family photographs. And I mean, I touched one of the little pieces of lace that Maud sewed herself. Unbelievable. And when you that, for me, that is just everything, to get that close. I mean, some of the photos were wrinkled or torn. I mean, and you feel this sense of connection, especially when you're writing about real people. You start to feel this intense sense of connection to the people. And especially when you get close to something that they touched and then you touched, and you just feel like, I don't know. It's uncanny. So yes, I did do a lot of travel. I go to the places, I look at them, I take pictures of them, but I also spend a lot of time in libraries and historical societies looking at old, faded pieces of paper and things like that. So.
Sounds very interesting. Very interesting. So you touched a bit on how every spring families back in the day would watch The Wizard of Oz on TV. And, you kind of described your own personal connection to a movie that's very powerful, and it touched on things, and, with Frank being so ahead of his time as well.
Right. I think, so first of all, you're making a really good point. Frank was really ahead of his time. He really was. And I think maybe that can be a blessing and a curse for people. And the other person who was really ahead of her time was his mother-in-law, Matilda. And so by extension, also her daughter. I mean, Matilda is not as famous as Susan B. Anthony, in part because she was much more radical. And yet, if you go back to Matilda and you read her writings now, they seem oddly prescient and they seem very modern. Some of the things that we do believe now, she believed at the time. And so, I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the examples that really struck me was that Matilda believed that in prostitution, the fault lay with the man who was hiring the poor woman, who was very often a widow or destitute and had no choices. And that was, that was unthinkable at the time, because that was a woman in sin and it was just her fault. And it wasn't until much later that ideas began to catch up, and they started to think that you were, that maybe the man was at fault as well.
Renee's frozen, so we'll give her a chance to rejoin. My name is Matt Binder. I work with Renee in the programs department. Hi, Elizabeth. We're meeting for the first time. Hello. You weren't going to meet me until we did the questions at the end. I do have some of Renee's
Thank you for jumping in.
So I will get to her next question. She wanted to ask, can you relate the story behind the story of Frank Baum's coat appearing in the actual movie?
Oh, that's one of my favorite stories. Of course, I'd love to tell you that story. So, well, first of all, you're talking about The Wizard of Oz, right? Magic, serendipity everywhere. And when I was researching, one of the things that I came across was this story, and it's a true story. The story is that that during the time that they were trying to find the coat for Professor Marvel to wear in the early Kansas scenes, in the movie, in the black and white scenes, they wanted a kind of a seedy, rundown style, and they wanted it to be in this Prince Edward style, which was common around the turn of the century. And they couldn't quite find the right coat. So the costume designer went down to a thrift store on Hollywood Boulevard and bought a rack of coats, and she brought them back to the studio. And they were trying them on Frank Morgan, and really there was only one that was suitable. And then at some point, Frank Morgan looked, and there was actually a tag in the coat, and the tag said L. Frank Baum. And that is the coat that he wears in the movie. Now, I mean, I love to believe in weird coincidences, but on the other hand, I'm skeptical. And so I looked into this claim to see if it was really true. And the people, the contemporaries who were working on the film confirmed that this was a true story. But not only that, but Maud herself, who I know was a person of impeccable integrity, said, yes, it was Frank's coat. And it turns out, well, which I didn't know, and I'm sure you probably wouldn't know if you hadn't read my book, L. Frank Baum and Maud lived in Hollywood. They lived there from about 1913 until Frank's death, and Maud still lived there in 1939. She could walk to Hollywood Boulevard. She could walk to Grauman's Chinese Theater where the movie premiered. And she was a thrifty woman. She was exactly the kind of person who would have donated old clothing to a thrift store. So there you go. That's the story of the coat. One of my favorite pieces of Wizard of Oz lore.
That is a wonderful story. I'm definitely going to use that at whenever we can have parties again.
Yeah.
Our next question, we're going to pivot away from the book and go into your book, The Perfect Horse.
Oh, sure.
That book deals with a part of World War II history that many people don't know about. What was your inspiration to write that book? And can you tell us more about your love of horses?
Oh, sure. So, well, The Perfect Horse, actually, I wrote it, it was a very often, as I said earlier, my stories are inspired by serendipity, and I'll see something that just it poses a question in my mind. And I don't usually think right at that moment, oh, here's my book. I just want to know the answer to the question. That is what happened with the story of The Perfect Horse. I was in an equestrian library doing research, and I love ephemera, little pieces of paper and old pamphlets and things and I found this box, and in the box there were these pieces of paper and different things that were about the cavalry. And I pulled out this brochure. It was really more just like a kind of a mimeographed piece of paper. And it said a parade of European horses at Front Royal, Virginia, April 16th, 1946. So 1 year after the end of the war. And I opened it, and they were talking about these Lipizzaner horses from Austria and Arabian horses. And I know about the Lipizzaner horses who perform in Austria and Vienna, and I knew about them, but Virginia, why are they here? Why, so I made a photocopy of this paper, and I stuck it in a file and forgot about it. But I kept wondering, what's the story? And as I started to look into what's the story, that's when I found this incredible thing, that these very rare and precious horses had been taken by the Nazis, hidden away, while they tried to basically breed the perfect war horse, and then eventually rescued by the American cavalry at the end of World War II. Again, this is a true story.
It is an incredible story. And I think our last question before we turn to Q&A is, would you like to tell us about what you're working on right now?
Oh, I would so love to tell you what I'm working on now, because I just, it's actually finished. My next book is finished, and it is, I just saw the cover of it. So my next book is called The Ride of Her Life. And it is another true story. So I've done 2 books about horses, and The Ride of Her Life is the 3rd book about horses. You have to go back to 1954 in Maine. And there was a woman by the name of Annie Wilkins. She was diagnosed with cancer and given 2 to 4 years to live. But at the same time, she was completely out of money. She lived on a rural small family farm and had been foreclosed on. But Annie Wilkins, she had no money. She didn't have any health. She really didn't have anything. She had a dream. And her dream was she wanted to see the Pacific Ocean one time before she died. But she didn't have a car. She didn't have any money. But she knew how to ride a horse. So she got a horse, took her little dog, mounted up in November from Maine, and took off to ride her way across the United States. And that's the ride of her life.
People are entering their questions. I just wanted to say that, that Finding Dorothy book offered so much for us in terms of what was supplied and how people in book clubs were so interested in all the stories behind the story. There were so many different angles to make it a great book club book. So, you had Frank taking Maud to the electric building at the Columbian Expo. You had the story of the coat. You had all those things. And it was just wonderful, and how the Over the Rainbow lyrics delighted everyone. So I'm not sure where we left off in terms of all that. Apparently everything just froze on my computer, but that's how it goes sometimes. So do you have anything else to add to any of the backstory behind your book?
Well, one thing that I think readers are often really interested in is a lot of times I get questions about, well, why didn't you include this, or why didn't you include that? And actually, the way that I write, I tend to write almost 2 full books, and then I cut and I cut and I cut and I cut, because I don't want the reader, I don't want to lose you. So I really boil it down until I only keep the things that are not just interesting, but really carry the story through. But there were some scenes that I would have loved to have included in the book. One of them was that, Matilda, she had such a fascinating life. And one of the things that I do mention in the book, but I didn't dramatize as much as I wanted to, was when she went to it was the centennial of the independence, the American independence. So it was 1876. And they were going to read the Declaration of Independence aloud in Independence Square in Philadelphia. And the women of the National Women's Suffrage Association had been planning and planning and planning to write and disseminate a women's Declaration of Independence. And what they did, and this is now Maud was a big ringleader in this, and also Susan B. Anthony and a lot of the top women suffragists at the time. They all went to Philadelphia, and one of them had some connection, and they managed to get themselves seated in sort of like, there was a kind of a dais where it was the acting vice president who was reading the Declaration of Independence. And Maud and her cronies were seated in this dais over on the side, where the press was supposed to be, and they were supposed to behave themselves, and they were all women and etc. Well, but they were prepared, and they had brought with them this document. And so at one point, they stood up and they got up from the dais and they approached where this man was reading the Declaration of Independence, and they handed him their women's Declaration of Independence. He was so startled that he took it. And then the women marched through the crowd, tossing, they had kind of rolled them up and tied them, tossing them through the crowd until they finally paraded around the corner. And then Susan B. Anthony read their declaration aloud. And I just love that story so much. It's a true story. And it meant something to me personally, because in 1776, Abigail Adams, who was John Adams' wife, had said, she had made a statement saying, "Remember the ladies, include ladies," in the concept of equality. 100 years later, Matilda Gage was presenting this Declaration of Independence, and she presented it to the daughters of 1976. And I consider myself a daughter of 1976. I was a teenager at the time. So I felt that they were really passing the baton to me and to all of the women now who've been really fighting in the Me Too movement and for women's equality in the 21st century. And I really love that. And I hope that we will also pass the baton to our daughters and granddaughters.
Yes, and your book describes how Maud felt in college, being the daughter of Matilda Gage, and I felt so bad for her, and how that she was essentially, that became a part of Maud's identity, that she was the daughter of Matilda Gage, as you say, the most progressive of the bunch.
Right. And thank you for saying that, because all of the scenes where I describe what Maud went through at Cornell, much of that was taken from letters that were written, not actually by Maud, but by her classmates. One in particular wrote a lot of letters, and she would mention Maud because Maud was sort of the leading light of the class, for better or for worse, among the women, because she was known as being what they called lively, which was not good in those days. But all of the things that I report with the Society of the Broom and the way that the men behaved and the way that the young women really had trouble, and they were constantly being harassed and catcalled. And here's Maud. Her mother was the one who very publicly pushed that through. So she was put in such an untenable position because she did embrace the values of women's equality, but she also had to go be the guinea pig. You know, Matilda gave Maud the opportunities that she wished that she had had, but Maud then had to be the one to actually go in and live it, and it was hard. And they had different personalities too. You know, they were both strong women in their own way, but they wanted different things. So I think it was hard for Maud. It was hard for Maud to run off with Frank. You know, that wasn't what her mother wanted. You know, I think Maud might be the only person who ever defied Matilda directly to her face.
Do we have any questions?
We do. We have two questions. Both are from Kirsten. Here's the first one. What is the meaning of the title? Did Maud find Judy Garland, i.e. rescue her?
Well, I think it's interesting with titles because I think that sometimes even the author doesn't know why the title is the title. And I think I would like to, I honestly wish I were seated with the book club now. This is the problem with technology, you know, because I've heard so many different things from readers, and I don't know. I mean, did she meet Judy Garland? Yes. Did she find Judy Garland? Yes. Did she rescue her? We know the historical record. We know what happened to Judy Garland. And I think that's very poignant that Judy Garland also was a woman ahead of her time and paid a very high price for being Judy Garland. So I don't know, but I want to say, I think it's relevant for me to say that writing is a really weird art because, and sometimes I'm jealous of musicians and painters and things where you know, you can just walk by and hear somebody's music or see their art hanging on the wall. But reading is this very interesting thing where you enter into this very, very deep dialogue with a reader, but that reader, you don't see them or hear them. But I write a book and then you read a book, and then somewhere in between becomes the book. You know, it has to leave my computer and it has to leave my hands in order to become the story. The meaning is constructed by the readers as much as it is by me. And I love when I talk to readers because they find these analogies and meanings and structures that I never saw. And then they say, well, did you put that in there? And then I'm like, well, I think you put that in there. You know, and it feels very much, I can't emphasize enough for all the readers that are out there. As the writer, you are an equal participant in the enterprise of novel writing, 100%. You construct the meaning in your mind, and that is as valid. So I love the question. I love the question that it poses, but I can't answer it really. You know, every reader would give you a slightly different take, and that's the beauty of it, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Her second question, why did you do dual timelines and not write a book just focusing on the interaction of Maud and Judy Garland and the making of the film?
Well, that's a good question too. I think actually for me, I was drawn to the story by this idea of Maud being on the set and wanting to see that her husband's vision was brought to the screen in the manner that it was intended. And if you think about being Maud for a second. So Frank died in 1919. Frank knew that there were going to be movies and movie studios. He actually, among his many, many other accomplishments, he was an early proponent of cinema and of moving pictures. And he died before that had really fully realized its potential. So part of it is just Maud's love for Frank and Maud's love, you know, knowing that this thing that he would have very, very dearly wanted was finally going to come to be. But part of it is, it's more than that. Maud's feeling about the story, because the story was inextricably linked to her own life. And the story had a meaning, and meaning was very important to the Baums. And Hollywood was a very regressive place in 1939. And so it wasn't just, honor my husband's memory. It was like, keep these ideas that we have devoted several generations of a family to, keep them alive and not twisted. And if you think about, I want to just remind you, many of your readers probably know, there were two very, very celebrated films put out in 1939. One of them was The Wizard of Oz. The other one, Gone with the Wind. Now, stop and think about it for a minute. Gone with the Wind has not aged well. Just this year, Turner Classic Movies was forced to, put out kind of like a disclaimer, a historical frame to explain particularly the racial attitudes and the Old South mythology that's embedded in Gone with the Wind. But at its time, Gone with the Wind was more celebrated than The Wizard of Oz. Now look at The Wizard of Oz. I mean, do you read the newspaper a single day without hearing a reference to The Wizard of Oz? Do you have a conversation with your friends without quoting Frank Baum? I mean, it's just, if you write a book about The Wizard of Oz, you will start getting memes and newspaper clippings sent to you like 24/7. I mean, this story is still so relevant. Why? Why? In my view, it's because the ideas of these very forward-thinking people, the Gages and Frank Baum, are in that movie. And so it stays modern and it stays relevant. Now that might not seem like that answered your question, but what I think for me is, I don't think that there was any way to tell the story of why the movie was so important to Maud and what the ideas were that were embedded into that movie that I believe make it still relevant without understanding what led to it. And what's more, I like to say, I think to me that Maud and Frank Baum, they had such an American story, because that's the story of so many of us. I mean, we come from immigrants. Most of us, did not, our ancestors arrived on these shores not rich, full of dreams, full of ideas, restless, wanting to go places, looking to the future. And that was very much who the Baums were. They were restless, kind of striving, dreaming, imaginative people who still were buffeted by life and history and things that happened to them, the times and everything. And the late 19th century, like the early 21st century, a time when it's very hard to kind of be your own person. Frank wanted to be his own man. He wanted to have his own business and make his own life. That was really hard then, because that was the beginning of mass industrialization and urbanization. And we kind of face a similar time now where, it's kind of hard. It's hard to be your own person. It's hard to be a small businessman in the era of Amazon. So all of these things, I don't think you understand them or would feel that they were so relevant if you didn't understand this story. That's why they call The Wizard of Oz America's first homegrown fairy tale, because it comes from a life, and it is a life that is representative in its way of the lives of many, many of us. And that's why it resonates with us, I think.
Well, that was lovely. Thank you very much. I don't think we've gotten any other questions. So I think this is where we're going to wrap it up.
Oh, wonderful. So if you don't mind, I hope you don't mind, but I would like to just hold up this book right here, just to let your readers know, this is actually my next book that's coming out. This is the Young Readers edition of the $80 Champion, which was my first book. It's a true story of a horse who was on his way to the slaughterhouse when he was found by a man who was a poor immigrant and a riding teacher in a school in New York. And he bought the horse for $80 just because he felt sorry for him, discovered that the horse could jump, and they ended up being the national champions in 1959 and 1958 and 59. Very happy story. It is a very good story for pandemic time because it's just very uplifting, and it's true. But anyway, the book came out in 2011. So 10 years later, they're putting out an edition for young readers, and I am excited about it, and I wanted to just let people know. So I think it's coming out December 1st. So anyone who has a child or a grandchild, they can look for this book. I don't know if you can see it. I'll try to hold it up a little better there. There you go.
One more question.
Okay.
What mark, if you'd like to answer it,
Sure.
what lasting mark did Matilda leave on the suffrage movement?
Oh, well, Matilda, this would be a whole nother book. Matilda was really kind of iced by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. At the end of the 19th century, there were two major women's suffrage groups. One of them was also very closely allied to like morality and temperance, and they thought that women should get the vote to civilize men. The other group thought that women should get the vote because they believed in the natural law of equality. And so they fought and they fought and they fought and they fought. And eventually, Susan B. Anthony was really a brilliant tactician, decided that the women would never win the vote if there were these two factions. And she brought the two factions together, but she brought them together over Matilda's dead body, because Matilda really didn't think that women should get the vote to civilize men. She thought women should get the vote because women deserved the vote, because they had an inherent right that was granted by the Declaration of Independence. Matilda went off and she actually formed another organization. And that organization was really more about things like workers' rights and people's rights. I mean, Matilda started to say, this is more than about just getting the women to vote. This is really about really thinking about how the system is oppressing women and looking at it from a lot of different angles. And when you look at Matilda's views about suffrage, really, like I said, she was very far out in front. So she had a lot of ideas that we believe now that at the time were horribly shocking. And I think I was starting to say right at the time that we froze, that one of the things that she did was when women were prostitutes, she would take the side of say that women are doing this because they're poor and they need to feed their children. The men who are hiring them should be punished. This is hypocrisy. She fought for rights of women in divorce. I mean, really, because we've just lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a lot of the things that Ruth Bader Ginsburg finally dismantled were things that Matilda felt very strongly about in the 19th century. Women being able to sign a contract, women being able to buy property in their own name, women being able to divorce their husbands if they wanted to. All of those things were put forward for her, but really did not come into being until much, much, much later. So she was a very important player in the suffrage movement, make no mistake. They really should put her name right next to Susan B. Anthony. She was very, very important. But she also had this, bigger vision, I guess you would say. And her ideas, and one more thing about Matilda, there's something called the Matilda effect, which has been talked about. So I want people to kind of listen for it. You may hear this or read it when you're reading a newspaper article. The Matilda effect is this effect that if a woman invents something like a scientific discovery, it tends to be credited to a man, even if it was first invented by a woman. That is now that's been dubbed the Matilda effect. So, and one more thing about Matilda, which is relevant to Finding Dorothy, Matilda was really fascinated with witchcraft. And Matilda wrote a very long book that talked about how witches were wise women, and that women, that accusing women of witchcraft was used as a way of bringing down smart, powerful women throughout history. And so where did Frank Baum get interested in witches? It was Matilda.
Well, we thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for stepping in also.